Hello everyone, my name's Andrew and I am a councillor at Basildon Borough Council, and what I'm going to share with you today and what I'm going to talk about today is my experience through mental health services. I think it's important to start at the start, right at the beginning when this first kicked off. I was 14 years old. I was quite an anxious, scared, worried young person. Some of my challenges started manifesting at school. I became increasingly withdrawn. I became increasingly isolated. I'd really take things to heart. When people might say something to me, I'd really internalise that. Really that'd be a big thing to me if someone said, oh, you're ugly or whatever. I'd really take to heart. And I never had an outlet for what was going on at school. I never had an ability to talk to anyone about it, really. I was always very guarded. And as time went on and things just got worse, I just couldn't express what was going on for me. I couldn't get things that I needed to out, which started to make me go crazy. So I started to become very depressed. The way I describe it is like, it was just a dark absence, this black cloud that just consumed me. I started to withdraw from school completely, so I stopped attending. I would be at home on my own in my room in a very dark place. Eventually I started hearing voices, so I started experiencing what's called auditory hallucinations. I had 3 voices talking to me in my head. Now imagine just being a young person, trying to get to sleep at night and having 3 people having a full-on argument inside your head. It was real to me. And as these voices started disturbing my sleep pattern, so the strange experiences I had continued. So I not only started to hear voices, I started to become a bit delusional. I started to become paranoid, so I'd think people were out to get me, people were coming to kill me. I would then become quite obsessive, so I'd have obsessive behaviours. I would start locking doors. I would start making sure things was clean. I'd become very ritualistic. And the problem with that is that it wouldn't just be I'd want to make sure the door was locked. It would be on the rare occasion that I did go out of the house and maybe get down to the town, I'd have to come all the way back again to check the door was locked. I'd have to check and check and check. I couldn't release myself from that checking behaviour. And I said the paranoia as well was quite significant because I thought everyone was out to get me. I thought people wanted to hurt me. I thought people were laughing at me. I also experienced what's called fault broadcast. So I thought that my faults could be read by other people. Now your thoughts are meant to be your sanctuary. Your thoughts are meant to be a place where you're safe, where you're secure, where you're comfortable. And knowing someone can read those thoughts and knowing those thoughts are being broadcast is terrifying. As out of all my experiences, that was probably the worst one. I also started engaging in self-harm behaviours, or I'd never tell anyone about this. So I would sometimes whip myself with a belt because I wanted to purify myself in my head. I would also sometimes punch myself in the head, because when some people talk about psychosis and mental illness and things like that, they sometimes think, oh, it's mental, it's not physical. But actually there was physical pain associated with my mental illness, and my brain would sometimes be so intense, my thoughts would be racing so intensely that rather than experience that, I would punch myself to try and escape from that. So I started to become really, really unwell, and eventually what happened was I had probably one of the most scariest meetings of my life, where a social worker and 2 doctors, one of which was my consultant psychiatrist, had a meeting with me. And that meeting was to decide whether or not I was going to be detained under the Mental Health Act. The reason for that meeting was the night previously, I had a complete and utter breakdown. I call it my psychotic breakdown. The voices were intense, my adrenaline was pumping, my fear was completely uncontrollable, and I felt someone was going to come to my house and kill me. I genuinely believe that. When people talk about delusions and paranoia and things like that, sometimes they, you've got to approach it. If you're ever talking to someone who is delusional, paranoid, they believe what's going on for them, to what they believe is real to them, and I genuinely believe someone was going to come and kill me. So I had to escape. My poor mum had no one to contact. There was no sort of specialist out-of-hours CAMS provision. The only help and support she was able to get was through the police. And when your son is unwell, you don't really think to call the police. You should have a healthcare professional responding, but the police were unfortunately the only ones. there. But anyway, that didn't matter because I decided I was going to go. And I jumped out my bedroom window, which is quite an achievement. I vaulted over my back garden fence, and then I decided to run. And I just ran, and I couldn't stop myself. I was absolutely terrified, but thankfully, I was picked up by the police. The police brought me back home, and there I was until this meeting the next day, where my fate, if you will, was decided. People think job interviews are scary. People think, appraisals are scary. A meeting to decide whether or not you're going to be detained under the Mental Health Act, that's pretty damn scary. And fortunately for me, I feel, I wasn't. I was able to be given some agency, but on the basis of I engaged in treatment. That was sort of the, I feel, deal that was come to. I wouldn't be detained as long as I would engage in the treatment. I think the doctors felt I wasn't enough of a danger to myself to warrant being detained, and I'm pleased they took that view, because losing your liberty is terrifying. And then eventually that led me to a position where I was admitted to a child and adolescent mental health unit. For a 15-year-old, a 14, 15-year-old, I can't remember exactly how old I was, that was quite a terrifying experience. You have a stereotypical image of what an inpatient psychiatric hospital is. You expect straitjackets, needles, people very distressed, and people were very distressed in there because it's a hospital and people were unwell. But it wasn't the stereotypical inpatient psychiatric unit that, Hollywood would like you to believe. It was more just like, rooms, sofas and things like that. It felt almost homely, which was quite refreshing. And it was also a place where I was safe, which I think is the most important thing. And I always remember my first time attending hospital, and my first day, and I was so overwhelmed with anxiety, confusion and worry, I couldn't even remember my own name or my own age. Someone asked me how old I was and what my name was, and I couldn't remember it. Anxiety does a lot to you, and that's the position that I was at. I was in hospital for a year, which is quite a long time, but I had quite a lot of issues to work through. And when I was in hospital, they prescribed me what's called Risperidol, so I was put on Risperidol, and that is an antipsychotic medication. And for me, the important thing about the antipsychotic medication, or that Risperidol, was, the way I describe it is, it put the brakes on things. It gave my mind a bit of time to breathe. It allowed me to start trying to work on some of the traumas that I experienced as a young person, some of the depression I was going through, some of the warped thinking I had, and that Risperidol was important. I was prescribed quite a high dosage of Risperidol, and it was tough. It was tough. The side effects of that drug are quite significant, so I started to put on weight. I started to what's called hypersalivate, so I would dribble effectively, and that's not a really good look for a 15-year-old. I developed a twitch in my right leg, so I started twitching. But I'd say the most significant side effect of Risperidol was the straitjacket effect on my mind. My mind couldn't think the way it used to think. My mind wasn't able to race with thoughts, race with creativity. It was very, very stunted. It felt like it was, some sort of chemical straitjacket. And whilst that sounds terrifying, it was actually important for me at that moment in my life, because I was at a position where I needed that because I was so unwell. If I didn't have that intervention, I'd probably be dead. And whilst I am, critical of, psychiatry, it's important to not be ignorant of the benefits that it could have. And for me, without that intervention, I probably would have ended up dead. So I was put on this medication, and because I wasn't, the word they use is compliant with it, so I wouldn't take it because I was scared of it, I eventually was placed on the injection. So every other week I would have 50 milligrams of Risperidol Councillor, it's called, for a 1-inch needle pumped into my arm. And the reason why they didn't do it in my backside, which is where they typically inject Risperidol, is because I said to them, I refuse, under no circumstances will I allow you to pump Risperidol into my backside. And they said, well, okay, what about your arm then? I said, no. So they said, right, if you agree to having it done in your arm, we won't pin you down and do it in your backside. That was effectively the deal. And I thought, even though I was psychotic at the time, even though I was in this distressed state, I guess I know a good deal when I see one. And I took the deal, and I was on this Risperidol. And I said it was a really difficult time for me, because when you're that age, you're developing your social networks. That didn't happen for me. When you're that age, you're getting your education. I didn't get my education. When you're 15, 16, you're making relationships, you're exploring the world, and I couldn't because I was in hospital. And the staff in hospital were absolutely lovely. They treated me with respect and dignity. In my CAMS adolescent unit, they were wonderful. But when I got discharged, they weren't there. They can't be there. It's an inpatient hospital. When I was in the community, that was probably when I was most terrified because I was alone. I had to face the big wide world on my own. I had to think about my education. I had to think about my future. I had to think about life, and I wasn't very well supported in the community. There was individuals in the community and mental health services that really supported me, who really went the extra mile. But in terms of the whole system, there wasn't anyone, unfortunately. And I felt very alone and very isolated. And in fact, I think it was more difficult being on my own in the community outside in the big wide world than it ever was in hospital. I eventually, though, started volunteering, and volunteering was just so rewarding for me because it challenged some of the negative perceptions I had of myself. It challenged some of the depressive thinking I had, but it also allowed me to get out of the house, which was hugely important. It gave me a bit of motivation back. And I would say the challenge with hospital was, hospital sort of sorted out the psychosis. It put the brakes on it. It sort of allowed me some time to start working on myself. But what it didn't do was sort out my depressive thinking, sort out my anxiety, and sort out my obsessive compulsive disorder. And that took a lot longer. And I had a psychiatrist in the community who was phenomenal, who prescribed me a different set of medications. So he moved me from risperidone, which is quite, in my view, a high-powered antipsychotic, although there are more powerful ones available. Abilify didn't have as much of a sedative effect. So it still had the sedate, it still felt like a straitjacket on my mind, but it also allowed me a bit more motivation. So actually transitioning from risperidone to Abilify was really, really important to me. I also was prescribed some other medications for sleep and for some of the obsessive compulsive behaviours. And that, in combination with some therapies that I was having, that really allowed me to start addressing some of the depressive thinking, start addressing some of the obsessional thinking, and really start to battle this psychosis. As time got on, I started building my resilience, building my social networks, building my community networks, and actually it was really rewarding. However, I still wasn't there yet because I was still unwell. I became what's known as a revolving door patient. So I'd become really unwell in the community. I'd then become really distressed. I'd then run away from my family or whoever I was with. The police would pick me up. They would take me back into hospital. I'd be admitted to an assessment unit. The assessment unit would go, "Oh, you're fine, no worries," and I'd be turfed back out in the community. And I was in this revolving door cycle for a while, up until the point where I said to myself, the next time I'll be coming back into this hospital would be in a coffin, because it was so draining. It was so draining to go through that process. It almost felt like I was on trial, because when I was in hospital, I wasn't believed. It was like they made me feel like I was making up my experiences. I remember one time when I called the crisis line, so the people you expect to help you in a mental health crisis, and they told me, if you keep ringing up to say you're going to kill yourself, we can't help you. And that was quite distressing for me. That was quite, not only was I really distressed, I also had the people that were there meant to help me not believing what I was saying and treating me like what I thought was a criminal. So I was in this revolving door cycle, and it came to a point where, as I said that next time I was going to come back would be in a coffin, and that wasn't what I was going to do anymore. But the depression really took hold. The loneliness really sort of crept in, and I wasn't in a good place. And it led me to a point where I seriously made an attempt to end my own life. And I always look back at my experiences, and I always think, if I could change anything, it would be that. Because I don't want to die. I've never wanted to die. I may have suicidal ideation, so I may think about death. In fact, I think about death and killing myself on a daily basis. It's something that is part of my mental health condition, and I'll always have it. But I don't want to die, because life is too important. And the reason I think I got to that point was I made a difficult decision. I decided to come off all of my medication without telling anyone. And the danger of me doing that was that it caused some significant physical side effects. it also caused a real turbulence in my psychological functioning and my mental health. So I was in a really vulnerable position by coming off my medication. It really sort of destroyed my life for a short period of time. It sent me, it sent me wild. I just wasn't in a good place. And I think if anyone's sort of watching this and looking for some advice and sort of wondering about their medications and what to do with it, I would always say there's nothing wrong with wanting to come off your medications. In fact, for me, coming off medication was probably one of the most important things. Because at that point in my life, I didn't need them anymore. I wasn't psychotic anymore. And what I needed was actually to get back into the community, make friends, build relationships, get my education back. I needed those things. And medication, for me, where it had quite a sedative effect, stopped me doing that. Also, the dribbling look wasn't a good look, and that was just a bit too much for me. But, I didn't have that conversation with my psychiatrist. I just did it. And I think that brought me to that position where I nearly ended up ending my life. So I say I wouldn't change anything from my journey, because I think my journey through the mental health system has made me who I am today. And whilst it was really painful, the experiences I have are really valuable. But I'd change that. If I had my time again, I would tell someone I was coming off that medication, and I'd do it gradually, because I never want to be in the position where I'm actively trying to take my own life ever again.